So much, Rochelle. And thank you for all the organizing. It's absolutely critical for a session like this to be successful. So it's my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Ariel Deardorff from the UCSF Library. She'll be speaking with us today on the topic of getting up to speed on the new NIH data management and sharing requirements. I think many of us have heard about these and are very eager to learn more. We're still all trying to figure it out. So it's really wonderful to have a guide to help us get oriented and identify what we need to know. Ariel is the UCSF Data Services Librarian and member of the library's data science team. In her role, she teaches classes and provides support for research data management, open science, and reproducibility in the health sciences. She's an expert in research data publishing and has led the library's involvement with several data infrastructure and policy projects. Ariel is also an open science advocate who performs research on the role of the library in enabling open and reproducible research. So all really cutting edge topics, constantly evolving. So we're very fortunate to have her with us this morning. And so without further ado, Ariel, I'd like to turn it over to you and you can tell us the roadmap for this morning's talk.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tor. And thanks everyone for joining us today to hear more about this new policy for data management and sharing. So Tor gave a great intro, so I won't need to go through much of this, but just a little bit of context sort of about who I am in relationship to this new policy. So as Tor mentioned, I'm part of the UCSF Library, part of our data science and data management team. So more broadly, this is a group within the library that helps researchers kind of wrangle and understand and use data. So whether that's finding data for research, learning how to analyze your data in a programming language like R or Python, or then make that data publicly available so that others can find and reuse it. So we really are excited about working with data and excited about working with you all to make your data dreams come true, let's say that. So my role here today is really one of an educator, so helping you kind of parse what can be very dense language from the NIH and figure out how to incorporate that into your research workflow. And as Tor mentioned, I'm also a researcher myself and have gone through all of this before. So I've made my data publicly available in an open repository. So I have some sense of what that can be like, what some of the challenges are, and what some of the benefits are as well. So I also want to put out there at the very beginning that if you have more questions after today, likely there will be still some questions, please feel free to send me an email. My contact info is here, or I'm always available for a free consultation. So in the library, we do free 30-minute consultations on a variety of topics. So you can always book one of those to follow up on anything that we talk about today. I also want to mention at the top, if you do have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I've got the chat open here so I can see those as they come in. We'll have plenty of time for questions. We should probably finish in about an hour, so we should have the last half an hour for questions, but I'll also pause a couple of times throughout to kind of look at some of those. So if you think of something, feel free to just throw it in the chat and we can answer that as they come in. All right, so here is our agenda for today. We're going to start off talking about this new policy in brief, just so you have the specifics or the broad strokes right up front. And then we'll look at sort of where this is coming from. In case you've heard of other data policies from NIH and you're like, aren't we already doing this? I want to give you some context on where we are. Then we'll dive into the policy in a lot more detail. So what's required? What do you have to do? When do you have to do it? And making sure you are kind of aware of all of that. And then I was asked to spotlight some of the new information coming out from the National Institutes of Mental Health. They just also released a new policy. So we'll spend a little bit of time going through that in a little bit more detail. So I know a lot of you are funded by NIMH, and so I want you to know what's coming out of that. And then we'll look more broadly at how do you plan for this? So there's the requirements, but then there's also what do you do when, and how do you incorporate this into your research workflow? So I want to talk about that. And then finally, we'll end with resources at UCSF. So who can help you, where should you go, and what resources are already available? Because we've already been creating several guides and other things as well. I think we have some folks who are unmuted, so I'm just gonna go ahead and mute you. I have the power to do that. Awesome. All right. So what is the highlight here? So first of all, we have a new, if you've never heard of any of this, there is a new NIH policy for data management and sharing that goes into effect in January. So January of next year, the end of January. So we have about 2 months to go. And this applies to all NIH research that generates scientific data. So it does not apply to training grants. It does not apply to fellowship grants. It applies to research that, or grants that for research that generate data. And we have a full list of, the specific letters if you're interested in diving into that. And the broad strokes is that this new policy requires researchers to prospectively submit a 2-page plan outlining how the data from your research will be managed and shared. This is your data management and sharing plan. And another highlight here is that data sharing is not 100% required, but you are expected to maximize the appropriate sharing of scientific data. So we're shifting the baseline here more towards data sharing as the default. In terms of timelines, data should be shared as soon as possible. So this is not something you're doing, after a year embargo or 5 years later. You're really tying it either to the publication that's associated with that data or the end of your grant, whichever comes first. And that this is also the minimum requirement. So we have seen more specific requirements come out from some different NIH agencies, and we'll talk about one of those in just a bit. But this is the policy that applies to everybody who is seeking NIH funds. So the really high-level summary, what's new here is the requirement for a 2-page data management and sharing plan that is much more detailed than previous data sharing requirements. And this idea that the baseline has shifted towards data sharing as the default. So this is something we're going to be reiterating throughout, is data sharing is expected. It's not required, but it is expected. So what is the overall goal here? Why have this policy? So NIH has been working on similar policies that I'll talk about in just a minute for several years now, but really here the broad goal is to increase public access to the results of federally funded research. So this idea that all NIH money is from the public, and really trying to return that information that is funded back to the public so that they can learn and use and grow from that. To increase transparency and reproducibility of research results. So making your data available so that somebody else can find it, they can look at it, they can use it to validate your studies, and to make data available for discovery and reuse. So ultimately, the goal of all of this is to make data available for others to use, whether it's in meta-analyses, education, replication studies, to develop new techniques. There's sort of an endless array of things that can be done with a vast amounts of public data. So one thing else I want to say at the very beginning is that there is a group, a task force convened by myself and in the library, as well as Joyce Abe in the Office of Sponsored Research, that has pulled together different research admin and faculty from across UCSF to really look at our own local policies and procedures and make sure that they are aligned with this new policy. Because we understand that data sharing as the default has not always been the case, especially those of us who work with human subjects data. There's a lot of things we need to consider. So we've been working on putting together communication, outreach, and templates, budget guidance, and I'll be highlighting those things throughout today. Okay, so now that you have at least a very general sense of what we're going to be talking about today, I want to take a step back and look at where this came from, because you might be thinking to yourself, I thought we already had a data sharing policy. So NIH has had a data sharing policy since about 2003, and this was the whole policy, basically that investigators who were seeking 500,000 or more in direct costs needed to include a plan for data sharing, or statewide data sharing was not possible. And there were specific timelines associated with this. But the kind of summary of this is it was pretty minimal work, and most of the data sharing plans were 1, 2, 3 sentences, and they really could say like data sharing or data will not be shared, and that was acceptable. So much more minimal. So if this was on your radar, if this is something you've been doing, the new policy is definitely more of a lift than this. In 2008, we had the public access policy, and this was really focused on making sure that the public had access to the published results of NIH-funded research, so your journal articles. And this required that anyone funded by NIH submitted their peer-reviewed journal manuscripts to PubMed Central upon acceptance for publication. And so this was really focused on, making the articles coming out of your research publicly accessible. And then in 2014, NIH introduced the genomic data sharing policy. So this was applied to all NIH-funded research that generates large-scale human or non-human genomic data. So here we had the first kind of real, more substantial genomic data sharing plan that you needed to write, and data needed to be shared in relevant public repositories in timely manner. And so compliance with this was evaluated at annual progress reports. And of course, researchers needed to plan for informed consent for human subjects. So this was more rigorous. There was a plan, but it was only for those of us that work with genomic data. So if you're thinking to yourself, I've been sharing my data for years now, it's very likely that you work with genomic data and you've been writing a genomic data sharing plan, which is great because you can share that expertise with everyone else, as this new policy applies to all NIH-funded research. So let's talk about the new policy a little bit more. So we all have to write these new data management and sharing plans. And what is included in those plans? So these are max 2 pages where you are asked to address these 6 different sections. So these include data type, what kinds of data are you collecting, what's the file types, how much data, what of that will be made publicly available. You need to describe the tools, software, and or code that is needed to access or use the data. If there's any data standards that you're going to be using, so this could include things like standardized file formats or file organization systems or common data elements, which we'll talk about more in just a minute. It's very broad, and I think the library can definitely help you think through what some of the standards relevant to your research might be. Oops, sorry, squeaky chair. Then the next section is data preservation, access, and timeline. So where will you make your data publicly available? What is the timeline associated with that? And then in the next section, access distribution. This is especially relevant for folks working with human subjects data, which is, are there any special things you're doing to safeguard your data? Are you putting it in a controlled access repository versus a more open repository? Have you made sure to get informed consent, etc.? And then finally, who is doing this work? So who will be in charge of ensuring that the data has been properly managed and shared? So this is the very broad strokes of what you are going to be writing about in your data management and sharing plan. So I also want to say right off the bat that not all research data has to be shared. So we've talked about this idea of data sharing as a default, but not 100% required. So NIH has outlined certain reasons that are justifiable reasons not to share your data. So these include things like informed consent will not permit or will limit the scope or extent of sharing. So especially if you're collecting data, or if you've been collecting data for several years and you were using consent forms that said things like, we will destroy the data or data will not be shared, it's really hard to then turn around and make that publicly available. So really making sure that you are adhering to the consent forms that you used. And existing consent prohibits sharing. So if you are working with, I think this one is specifically for physical specimen. So if you had consent, once again, that says, we can't make this physically, or we can't make this publicly available. The privacy or safety of research participants would be compromised. So even if you, have de-identified the data, but you're still like, oh, this is a really small population, or, this is a very sensitive topic, that's another reason you can justifiably say, it doesn't make sense in the context of this study to share this data. If you're working with or other groups, whether it's tribal nations, foreign nations, you're collecting data in another country that has different laws, NIH recognizes that we need to follow those laws. So you can't share data that is not allowed to be shared by other existing laws. If there's agreements, so especially if you've gotten data, maybe you're working with Medicare data, maybe you got data from a third party, you generally sign some kind of agreement when you took that data, and often those agreements say that you can't then turn around and make that public. So that's another reason you can say it's not able to be shared. And finally, if your data is all on paper and you just cannot actually digitize it to make it publicly available with reasonable efforts, that is another reason that they've outlined as a justifiable reason not to share your data. So we're still learning more about what some of these look like. Some of these categories are quite broad. And, I think one thing that I'll probably highlight throughout is we have some information from NIH, and I think we're going to be getting a lot more information as this actually goes into effect and people ask a lot of questions. So we might be learning more about sort of the details of some of this, but this is what we know right now. So where should you share your data? So when we talk about data sharing, sometimes people think, oh, I share my data. It's, there's a line in my paper that says, send me an email if you want to access it. But what we're really talking about here is making your data publicly available in a discipline or data specific repository. So not email the author or, I'm sharing within my lab or I'm sharing with another institution, but making that data available in a third party repository. So NIH has not generally called out specific repositories, but they do have a list of open domain-specific data sharing repositories, as well as other NIH-supported repositories. It's quite a long list, so it can be a little bit difficult to navigate, but we've also curated some more targeted lists to ones that we think are the most relevant. If there isn't a repository for your data type or your discipline, and there definitely is not one for every discipline, then we recommend a generalist repository. So a generalist repository takes all kinds of data. It's, whatever you want to put in it, basically. And so one example of that is Dryad, and UCSF is a member of Dryad. So if you can't find one that works for your research, that is a good resource. And finally, at UCSF, we recommend the use of controlled access repositories if you're working with de-identified human subjects data. So in this case, a controlled access repository is one that is not freely available for everyone to access the data. So people can find the data, so it is made publicly available, but in order to access it, you generally need to apply for access, be approved, sign data use agreements. So it is more public than just you keeping it locally, but it is still has some of those access controls in place. So the library, as I mentioned, can help with identifying a repository for your needs. And we've also, along with CTSI, started becoming members of certain repositories. And so what that means is that if you want to upload your data to Dryad or Vivly, which is part of a clinical trial, or which is for clinical trials, or the qualitative data repository, those would have had a fee associated with them, but they are now free for UCSF researchers. Okay. All right. Just looking at a question here about kind of the timeline associated with sharing, share the data after the prior project period and publication. Data be shared during the project. So generally the timeline of sharing is tied to either publication or the end of the performance period, whichever comes first. But we'll talk about the NIMH one in a minute. They have a slightly different timeline. So you always want to look at your individual kind of grant announcements just to be sure about the timeline. So how are these plans evaluated and enforced? So program staff will assess the plan. So these are not going to be part of the peer review process, but peer reviewers can comment on the proposed budget. So this is really program staff will be looking at it. So your plans will be part of the terms and conditions for extramural awards. And so non-compliance can result in termination of awards. So, we do want to make sure that we're doing these properly. And compliance will be monitored during progress reports. So what this looks like exactly, I think we're still learning, but I imagine that, you will be asked to say, how are you preparing your data for sharing, or once you've shared it, can you share a link to where that's made publicly available? And how do you pay for this? Unfortunately, you're not getting a whole bunch of new money to use for data management and sharing, but NIH has outlined certain allowable costs that you can include in your budget. And so these include things like curating data and developing supporting documentation. So especially thinking here about de-identifying your data, which can be costly sometimes if you need like a third-party service to do this for you. This is things like local data management considerations. So if there's large or special infrastructure that you need locally before you make your data publicly available, and preserving and sharing data through repositories. So I mentioned before that, we're covering the repository fees for certain repositories, but there may be other ones out there that also charge fees. And so just making sure that you've identified what those are and are including those in your grant. And I see a question, does this apply to new grants or already ongoing grants? So it applies to everything that's submitted after that January 25th deadline, or that is renewed after that January 25th deadline. So yeah. All right, so I'm just gonna pause 1 sec, take a drink. All right, so that was the general high level requirement for all NIH grants. But I also mentioned that the individual institutes and centers might have their own more specific requirements. So one of those is the National Institutes of Mental Health, NIMH. And so I'm going to spotlight what that more specific requirement looks like, because I know that several of you are funded by that group. So NIMH also has a new data sharing policy that they announced about a month ago, so it's pretty recent. And this new policy is building off of the new broader NIH policy, but it's giving you more specific guidance. So if this is not relevant to you, if you're not NIMH funded, go get a coffee and come back in like 5 minutes, because we have about 5 slides here. But in brief, this new policy for this institute requires investigators funded by NIMH to deposit all of your data in the NIMH Data Archive, or NDA. So they're calling out a specific data repository that you should be using. They also recommend, or require in some cases, the use of common data elements, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And they require you to include specific language in your data management and sharing plans. So let's break these down in a little bit more detail. So they call out the use of the NDA to be your data archive of choice. So in some ways, this is nice because you don't need to go research all these other data repositories. This is the one you should be using. And I see a note from Judy here. NIAAA is also using that same archive. Yeah, so this archive is used for a lot of different NIH agencies. So before, HIV-related research was not required to be deposited into NDA, and now it is. So that's a new thing to pay attention to. And if you were already depositing your genomic data into NDA, you should continue doing that. So there's not really any difference here. They're just calling out that, if you were already doing this as part of your process, that is still the thing to do. And one thing I will add here, and maybe if anyone has deposited data into this repository before and wants to throw some notes in the chat, feel free. But this is a more robust repository. And so what that means is there are more guidelines around how to submit your data, the use of specific data collection instruments. So not only how to submit your data, but how to collect that data and making sure that that data can be easily combined across studies. There's guidance around informed consent language you should be using. There's a specific timeline for submitting data. So unlike the more general requirements where it's submit your data without publication or at the end of the performance period, this repository has a kind of every 6 months submission timeline. So it's important to kind of research that, be familiar with what that looks like. And there is a specific data use agreement that you also will sign. So this one is a little more, there's a little more going on here. So definitely spending some time getting to know this data repository. If you're not familiar with it, it seems like they have a pretty good set of webinars and tutorials, how-tos to kind of walk you through it. There's a lot of documentation. So that is nice, but you might need it. So one thing to be aware of. So you should be depositing your data into this very specific repository, and you should be using common data elements. So if you're not familiar with common data elements, they're standardized, precisely defined questions paired with a set of allowable responses. And so these are the idea here is that you're using these systematically across different sites, studies, or trials to ensure consistent data collection. So rather than, for example, perhaps in one study you have a pain scale and you're using from 0 to 5, 5 being the worst. Maybe another study also has a pain scale, but it's 1 to 10. And maybe another study has a pain scale that's like a sad face to a happy face. It's really hard to combine data from all of those different studies later on. So the idea behind common data elements is you all choose one pain scale in this case, or measurement that then can be used across all studies and make it much easier to combine data. So the idea is to use existing sociodemographic, behavioral, clinical, or phenotypic measures rather than developing your own. And so there are a general set of common data elements that are recommended for all the mental health research that's in NDA. And what's new is that the Division of AIDS Research has identified a minimal list of data collection instruments for HIV research as well. So this was me parsing these two different notices that just came out. So my sense is that because this just came out about a month ago, there's not really one place where all of this information is nicely laid out right now. So I've tried to put in the links here to what I think are the best places for this information. But unfortunately, I think right now the best information about the list of data collection instruments for HIV research is in the actual grant notice. So hopefully they'll put more of that information on their website soon. They also call it other specific CDEs for COVID, for eating disorders, and those are all listed on the website. So some of this is a little bit in flux. I think eventually they will have better documentation on their website. But as of right now, something to be aware of is there are specific common data elements or measurements that you likely should be using in your research. So definitely integrating that into your planning process. And yes, Sarah, NDA is a restricted access or controlled access repository. So the last thing to be aware of for this NIMH funded research is that you are putting your stuff in a specific repository NDA, you're using common data elements, and all of that you are describing in your data management and sharing plan. So when you're writing your data management and sharing plan, this is actually a little bit easier because you already know you're going to talk about submitting data to NDA, you're going to talk about using common data elements, you're going to talk about that schedule of uploading data every 6 months. And what's nice about this group is they've also put together a budget calculator. So if you want to look at, how much time should you be budgeting for preparing data, for submitting data, they have the best and / only calculator I've ever seen for coming up with those figures. So I would definitely take a look at that. And finally, while this is a lot more structure and a lot more things you need to include, this is also the only agency that's actually created sample plans that you can use. So definitely take a look at those. They're available online. We've linked to them here. I've linked to them on the main NIH policy website that we've created. So that's really great because you can look at those plans, you can copy and paste, you can fill in your own information and know that you will be kind of meeting the standard and will be good to go. So definitely example plans, use those. All right, so that was our detour into things that were specific to everyone who is funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health. So before we take a step back and look at how do you plan for this, how do you incorporate this into your research workflow, I'm just going to pause and see if there are any more questions that folks want to put in the chat about just anything we've talked about so far in terms of requirements, what to do, NDA, any of those things.
Ariel, I started to type a question in the chat, but then it got kind of involved.
Yeah.
So it's okay if I just come over the line here and ask you about this. I've attended some of the NIH sponsored introductions to this new policy and looked at some of the material online. And one thing that was really interesting to me is I walked into those with an assumption that once you put the data up, it would be there in perpetuity. But some of the examples and discussions revolved around limited time horizons for sharing, and figures like a 5-year sharing horizon or a 10-year sharing horizon were presented. And I was just curious about your take on whether there are any norms that are emerging around the time horizon and what the reason would be for having a limited horizon. Does that have to do with people's concerns that the data might become outdated, or is it more of a concern about there's just limited storage capacity? It was interesting to me because I just had, like I said, this initial assumption that once you put it up there, it would be there forever and accessible forever.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Tor. And I think that, everything that I've seen leaves it very open as to how long data should be shared. Generally, the repositories that I've worked with kind of assume that you are sharing it in perpetuity, and that's kind of their preservation plan, is we will keep making this available. I haven't really seen anything that's about decommissioning or taking down data after so many years. Probably the storage size piece of that, maybe certain repositories, especially ones working with larger like genomic data sets, might be thinking about that. But that's a really good question. It's not really something that I've seen a whole bunch of discussion around. I think most people, the language very much leaves it kind of open and assuming that you are making it public for forever, basically. But that's another area where we might see more conversation, more maybe field specific guidance come out in the next year or so.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I see a question about obtaining granting approval to access data that's shared in a restricted access repository. So yeah, great question. So in general, most controlled or restricted access repositories have some kind of data governing board. And what they do is that, first of all, when you make your data available through that repository, you sign some kind of data sharing or data transfer agreement saying, we transfer this data to you, and understanding that this is how you will be safeguarding it, this is how you will be making it publicly available. And then when somebody wants to access the data, depending on the repository, there's slightly different steps, but generally they will need to say, here's our IRB approval for this data, here is our research plan, here's how we're going to use it appropriately, and then the data governing board for that repository will approve it, yes or no. And then depending on, once again, the repository and the kind of data, they will say, here, now you can download it locally, or they might only let you access it in some kind of secure environment. So if it's very sensitive, they might have a virtual data enclave or something where then the researcher can access the data there. So it does kind of slightly depend based on the repository where you are trying to access it. But that's generally what the plan looks like, or the process looks like. Yeah, so question about changes to data once it's uploaded. Can it be retracted or fixed? So yes, generally, most repositories have a versioning process. So you can, say, whoops, we made a mistake, or we want to change something, you would upload a new version and it would be noted that this is like version 2 of the data. And sometimes the earlier versions are also accessible. Sometimes in some cases, if you're like, oh my gosh, there was something in there that really should not have been shared, then you can work with the repository and they can, make sure that that's no longer available. So I think more and more repositories are doing a good job of kind of scanning incoming data and making sure that there's nothing, no PHI, no PII. Every once in a while, something might slip through, and then, they're definitely wanting to make sure that that gets taken down. But yeah, in terms of, just if your own, like, oh, this wasn't the right format, or, we did the wrong version, then you can definitely version that as well. Good question from Christine about informed consent. And we will actually talk about that in just 1 minute. So with that, maybe I will jump into the planning piece of things, but thanks for all these questions. A question about 6-month timeline. That's a good question. With the NIMH 6-month timeline, I'm not actually sure if it starts the time of the grant or once data collection begins. That's something I would need to dive more into the details of NDA to see what it says. Yeah, they have a lot of documentation, so I'm sure it says something about that in there. We can follow up. All right, so planning. Okay, so the one thing I want to emphasize here is that there are certain things we need to do to prepare in advance for data sharing. And I've tried to kind of break these down into 3 main time frames. So the first is project planning and grant writing, then when you're collecting and analyzing your data, and then when you're publishing and sharing your results. So let's start with what you need to do at the very beginning. This is when you are checking your sponsor agreements, you're incorporating data sharing into your consent forms, you're researching data repositories, incorporating costs for data sharing into your grants, and writing your data management sharing plan. So let's talk about those. And I've got a little star next to all of the ones that are National Institutes of Mental Health specific. So I've tried to call those out. So first, we're checking our sponsor agreements. So like I said, there's this general policy, but individual institutes and centers might have more specific guidance. So this is where you're looking for things like, is there a specific repository that's called out for my kind of data? So once again, here for NIMH, we're calling out the use of NDA. Are they recommending that data sharing be restricted? Or if you are working with a sponsor that restricts data sharing, that actually says, you can't share this data. Is there a mandated timeline for sharing? Are there recommended file formats or standards? So once again, we're calling out the use of common data elements for NIMH funded research. And then we're incorporating that data sharing into your consent forms. So it's important to get consent from research subjects in advance to share their data. So the nice thing is that if you are already using the UCSF IRB consent form templates, I think they were updated a little bit ago, they have this language in it. So you don't need to do anything special to comply. That is, you're already good to go. NDA does have a plain language description and other information that you can use in your consent forms if you want to pull from that as well. But here, it's what I would recommend is if you're using older consent forms, if you maybe haven't updated yours in a while, to just take a look at those and maybe take a look at the ones linked here and just make sure that you have that information about data sharing in your consent forms. This is also when you're researching data repositories. So before you start collecting any data, it's a good idea to spend some time looking at data repositories so you'll know what to expect when it's time to share. So some things to look at are, are there standardized files, formats that I need to use? What files do I need to submit? What is the turnaround time? Is there a cost for data sharing? Calling out the NDA repository. Or the link to their contributor guide, but just familiarizing yourself with the repository. So just in case you're not funded by National Institutes of Mental Health and you don't know which repository to choose, this is the general kind of approach to it. First of all, if there's one named in your funding announcement, that's the one you should be using. If there isn't, is there a repository specific to your discipline or data type? And then finally, is there a generalist repository available? So how do you find one, or how do you know if there is one that is available for your discipline? So the NIH has quite a long list of NIH-sponsored repositories. It's a little hard to parse. So what I like is this scientific data guide to data repositories, which breaks it down by like imaging data, omics data, social science data repositories. It's a little easier to find, 2 or 3 that might be relevant. And then we've also curated a guide to data repositories. And here we talked about this idea of controlled versus open access to data, thinking about what makes the most sense. Are there fees associated with it? And here mentioning that we recommend controlled access repositories for de-identified human subjects data. I do say there's a note about would like the media or political groups be unlikely to access our data? So one thing I do want to emphasize is that this is a recommendation for controlled access repositories. It's not a requirement. So we do have a process, and I'll talk about that in just a couple more slides, about if the repository for data or discipline is an open repository and you want to use that one, that's okay. You just need to do a little, fill out a little form. So we're recommending this idea of controlled access as the default, but we recognize that for certain research subjects or data types, maybe you want to make it more publicly available. So here's some ideas for disciplinary repositories, if you're not familiar with these. For clinical research, Vively is a really good resource. This is controlled access. It's also free for UCSF researchers because we are a member. For neuroscience, there's Open Neuro. I wanted to highlight this one because it does require a specific data format, the BIDS data structure or data organizing format. So definitely you want to make sure you're using that format as you're collecting your data. And then other ones here, there's resources for imaging. There's the HIV or National Addiction and HIV Data Archive Program, which is another controlled access repository. If you're working with qualitative data, the qualitative data repository is another resource that does allow you to control access. It's also free for UCSF researchers because we are a member of them. And finally, the AD Knowledge Portal for Alzheimer's disease is another controlled access option. So once you've picked your data repository, making sure that you looked at, are there any costs associated with that? And looking at some of the other costs that you might want to consider. So here, it really does depend on how big your project is, how many people are on the team, how complex the data is, who's going to do the work to kind of prepare that for sharing. Do you need like a whole new person if you're working on a huge multi-center project? Do you need to have the data certified, de-identified, which some repositories may require, like Vively, for example? And is there a cost associated with the repository? So I have tried to identify all the repositories that have a fee, and I believe at this point we are members of all of those. So I don't think that data deposit fees will be a huge part of your budget, but it's always good to double check and incorporate all of these into your grant. So as I mentioned before, if you are using the NDA repository, they have a really nice cost estimation tool. All right, so then once you have all of that information, you know where you're depositing, you put together your budget, you will describe all of this in your data management and sharing plan or your DMS plan. So there is a format that NIH has put out. They have a template, and we have also here at UCSF put together some template language. So we have 3 templates now available for clinical data, for a general one, and one for social science data. And this is what they look like. There's the highlighted part is what you kind of, fill in the blank, edit, modify to make it relevant to your research. And I also mentioned already that if you're using NDA, they have sample data management and sharing plans, which are really nice and are, like I said, the only ones that are now available from NIH. All right. So that's all the work that you're doing at the beginning. So you do all that work, you submit your grant, you get all your money. and now you're starting your project. So what do you need to do during your actual project? So here, really, it's just about following that data management and sharing plan. So making sure you're keeping on top of, keeping your data organized, you're using those standards. And depending on who funds your research, you might have a little bit more work here to do as well. So it does seem like for NIMH funded research, there might be, that six month or every 6 month timeline, you might need to start depositing data a little bit earlier as well. So another thing to pay attention to. But in general, just keeping up to date on everything here. And for most people, the actual sharing part does not happen until more at the end of a project. So this is when you're publishing and sharing your results, you're preparing your data for sharing, you're getting institutional approval for sharing, and you're uploading your data to a repository and getting your DOI or accession number. So preparing your data for sharing. So this is where you are making sure your data, if you're working with human subjects, has been properly de-identified to protect patient privacy. So you're removing that PHI. We do have a service at CTSI where you can ask questions and get help with data de-identification. It's a pretty small service. They definitely can't help everyone, but that is a resource that's available. I do see a question about certification of de-identification. So there is a third-party service that UCSF contracts with that we basically pay to do that. So we have information about it on, is it linked from here? It's linked from one of our slides. So that's a resource as well. One thing I'll note is that we are not, as an institution, requiring that you have your data certified, that all data be certified de-identified. So that some repositories might require that, but that is not a requirement across the board. If you're working with qualitative data, this can be a little more challenging sometimes to de-identify, because it's not just a matter of removing your PHI or HIP identifiers, but also those indirect identifiers. So I've got a link here to a guide that I think is really helpful to kind of help you think through, what are some of the other things that I might want to take out of my my data set before making it available. And if you have more questions about, data privacy, PHI, what I need to remove, the Privacy Office is a good resource here. Beyond de-identification, or if you're not working with human subjects, other things to remember are to make sure that you're curating and packaging your data with everything you need to understand and use it. So it's not just the data itself, it's those data dictionaries, it's your analysis scripts, your data guides, your interview protocols. So anything that somebody would need in order to actually understand and use the data. So you're putting all of that together. If you can save it as a more open or common data format, that's ideal. It just makes it a little bit more accessible. So, rather than saving it as a very expensive proprietary software file, if you can make it a more common file format, that's always recommended. It's not always possible, but that's what we recommend. So getting all of your data together, all the documentation, saving it in more open formats, and then getting ready to upload it. So then institutional approval for sharing. So this is a pretty new process, and we're still kind of working out some of the details here. But this is what we're requiring if you are sharing de-identified human subjects data. So if you are working with non-human, other basic science data, you don't have to do any of this. You can just go ahead and share it. But if you are working with human subjects data, this we recommend that you use a controlled access repository. And the thing you do here is when you go to upload your data into the repository, there is almost always going to be a data sharing agreement that you need to sign from the repository. So they'll say, great, your data looks good here, please sign this agreement. So rather than signing that agreement on your own as the PI, you will need to work with UCSF industry contracts to sign that agreement. And that's kind of our one little check to just say, hey, does this seem okay that you're making this public? Is this the right venue for this? And they can just look that over real quick. So that's already a requirement, actually, is we generally don't want PIs to be signing data transfer or data sharing agreements without working with industry contracts. So a lot of people don't know that, but that's something to be aware of. So I just have a call out here, for the NDA has a data submission agreement. So once again, you would work with industry contracts to do that. If, however, you want to share your data in an open repository, or if you have a controlled access repository that's maybe new or it's one we're not familiar with, here is where we have a slightly new process. Some people, for example, maybe you're a neuroscientist, you want to share your data in Open Neuro. Open Neuro, perhaps by its very name, is not controlled access, it is open. But that is kind of the main repository for that discipline. So in that case, we want to make that available to you. We want to allow that. So we have a slightly new process where you would email this data sharing at ucsf.edu. We are putting together a quick little form, but for now, just send it a description of your data and the name of your repository. And there's a committee that meets once a week that can quickly look that over and approve it. So we don't want to make it possible for you to share your data in more open places if that is, makes sense for your research, it makes sense for your community. Question about staffing and turnarounds for industry contracts. So yes, they are very aware of this new requirement and have been preparing to kind of staff up to meet this need. Ideally, we are long-term working on sharing master agreements with all of these data repositories so that not every single person needs to do this every time. But we will see how easy we can do that. It's not part of the process on the repository side, so they're a little bit confused by that. But ideally, we will have maybe a different process in the future when we have worked with more of these repositories. And a question about downsides to using controlled access repositories, like not meeting journal requirements. So generally these controlled access repositories are totally fine with journals. They understand that some data should not be as open as other kinds of data. What they are looking for generally is that you are not the person making the data publicly available. But if it is in a repository, if there's a repository approvals board, that is generally fine with them. And just a question about controlled access. So controlled access, it's kind of a broad term, but it generally means that there are some sort of access controls in place, some kind of data sharing or data use agreement, and some kind of application or approvals process in order to access the data. So it is still publicly available, you can find it, but it is not necessarily publicly accessible without going through an application. And most of the ones that we are recommending are the repository itself will decide whether somebody can access the data. So as an uploader, as a researcher, you look and see like what are the cases in which they will make it available. You agree with that, and then from then on they make the call. There are some where it comes back to the original researcher, but that is not always acceptable to journals. And I think that we have not recommended any of those as of right now. So generally the repository makes the call. And I will say that, we work really closely with a lot of repositories, including Dryad, and they are also still figuring out their processes with this new policy and trying to figure out what it means for them. And, if they need more kind of access controls or procedures. So we're all kind of working on this at the same time, I'll say. And so when this is all ready to go, this is when you're going to upload your data. You've gotten your approvals, upload your data to your chosen repository. Question about data and analyses. So generally not your analyses, but you're uploading your data and supporting documentation. We'll say that. So anything that would be needed in order to understand the data, dictionaries, other protocols, things like that. We'll come back to that question in just a minute. So when you deposit your data, depending on the repository that you're using, you might get a DOI or a digital object identifier, you might get an accession number, you might get a PID or permanent ID. This is the kind of permanent link associated with your data. And this is how other researchers will cite your data. So data citation is sort of the way that we are moving in order to have everyone get credit for this data that you're making publicly available. So ideally in the future, and there are many different organizations trying to push us in this direction, on your CV, your progress reports, you will have, here's all the papers I wrote, here's all the data that I produced, and get credit for that as a real valuable output of research. So you'll also link to these in your papers, your grant progress reports. So here's two examples of data citations, one from Dryad and one from Import, a different database. All right. So finally, I just want to wrap up with some resources here at UCSF. So the number one resource, and I wish that I could grab this. I don't think I can copy this. No, it's not gonna let me copy it. But the number one resource is that we have a library website where we've consolidated all of the information I've just gone over into one place. So this is where you can find those templates with the sample language. This is where we've been collecting all of the FAQs that people have been asking us. This is the budgeting resource that we've been working on locally. It's not quite done yet, but when it is, it will be on this page, and as well as places to get help. So all of this information, everything that I've talked about today is there. And one of the things that's there is, I guess, the second half of my presentation about planning for data sharing really comes from this guidance that we've put together, which is basically what I just went over. What should you do at the beginning, at the grant preparation stage, and then what do you need to do at the data sharing stage? So this is where you can find all that information about who can help you, the informed consent forms, preparing data, institutional approvals, who you need to email, all of that is in one place. And we've been updating this as we've kind of changed some of our procedures. So the library and myself and my team, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have, we're kind of an education arm. We offer free one-on-one consultations and workshops. We can help you with finding data standards, selecting data repositories, planning for data sharing, or a host of other, we have lots of resources and guides that we've been working on to really guide you through this process. All right, so I think we're at the top of the hour, which is good. So my high-level takeaways for you today are that there are new requirements coming soon for data sharing. So if you remember nothing, remember that likely we'll have to start planning for sharing your data. So now is the time to learn more about depositing data, especially if you're depositing data in NDA. There's a little bit more required for that repository. So start reading more about that repository, look at some of their submission guides. They have a lot of resources available. Look at some of the other the templates for the data sharing management plans. Start thinking about how you would edit those with your own information. And finally, that there's help available. So myself and my team in the library, there's lots of other groups at UCSF that have been thinking about this really carefully for months and months. So we are happy to answer questions, to help you write your plans, and to make sure that you know how to comply and feel comfortable with everything. All right, so with that, I will answer some of these questions that have been coming in. And I know that we are at 11, so if you have to go to another meeting, feel free to peace out now too.
Yes, and Ariel, I'd just like to come on the line and thank you for this. This is really an outstanding presentation, just absolutely fantastic and covers so much wonderful ground. I did want to mention that you've kindly agreed to return next week to the qualitative working group to do a follow-up session for qualitative researchers. And I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Kim Kester, to come on the line and share a little bit about that for those who may be interested.
Great, thank you, Tor, and thank you, Ariel. I just want to qualify that next week we will be hosting a qualitative working group roundtable discussion, and Ariel is going to give us a high-level overview and will be a part of the discussion. But the intent, I think, is really for those of us, and I'm hoping many of you in the audience will join us, come and process how we're feeling really about this. And then we'll tackle how are we going to be dealing with this as we move forward. So I'm going to post the information about the meeting in the chat. We will be advertising it through our usual sources, so you will get it there as well. And I just want to say for the qualitative researchers who are on this call that my concern only increased as I was hearing Ariel describe these the new data management and sharing requirements. And so we'll figure out a way to cope with this together. And I'll just say that these regulations are not built with qualitative research in mind, certainly not when you're working with populations who are already difficult to build rapport with. So we will talk and we will figure our way forward, and we'll start with that next week.
Yes, thank you, Kim, and thanks for letting me come lurk in your conversation. I'm very interested and you know I've shared qualitative data and have struggled with some of those questions around how do you de-identify like interview transcripts with lots and lots of information in them. So I'm excited to kind of listen in and see what you all are thinking, and if there's things we take out of that we can then advise other people. I think that would be really valuable. So yes, please do everyone come. All right, so let's see other questions. I guess there's a poll up as well if folks want to fill that out, or looks like you are filling that out, which is great. Let's see other questions that are coming in. So there was a question about how do we, as investigators, ensure that those who are accessing our data are not proposing analyses that we or our mentees have already planned? Yes, unfortunately, you cannot really ensure that. That is one of the potential downfalls of making your data publicly available, is that, there is always a possibility of being scooped. I think that people maybe worry about that a little bit more than it actually happens, but depending on the kinds of data you're working with, the discipline that you're in, sometimes that is more likely. One thing that you can consider is, you don't need to make all of your data public. So maybe when you're sharing a more targeted subset that's tied with a paper, and then, making other parts of it available with tied to a future paper. So kind of thinking about, how do you want to make it publicly accessible? It doesn't always have to be, here's everything that we've collected. So that's kind of one potential approach. Yeah, so question about how to best budget. So yeah, so on the, so like I said, we're still working on that template. It should be available maybe this week or next week. But for now, looking at the NIH guidance around budgeting, and that's here actually, why don't I stop sharing this and see if we can all go to that page together. I'll just put the link in so we can all have it right now. So this is the #1 page with all the information, and I've linked as well. One of the FAQs I think is about budgeting, cost and sharing. So here's the kind of broad categories. You can read more about budgeting and in the and what they call out. And then if you are working with NDA, their budgeting template has lots of really good information. So I've linked to that in the slides as well. Or looking at your question here, I get them all done for the indoor product, avoiding scooped. Yes. I mean, I think it's a real question how this will change people's research workflows or approaches to work. Hopefully it'll also maybe push people to make stuff more public that they used to keep tucked away or not share. But yeah, I think it's a real good question. How will this impact research? I will be making my slides available. I don't know how they will be distributed or if they will be distributed. Rochelle, will we send them out to folks? Oh. Maybe Rochelle has taken, oh yes, thumbs up. So yes, we will be sending those around. And actually, There's already a version of the slides, although without the specific guidance for NDA that is available on that main website. So sorry, why is that so wide? Let's go back here. So on this main library page, I have a link to my general library class, which is very similar to this one, which you can find here. So that includes, that's very similar. So if you want to get there right now before we send them out. Other questions? Let's see here. Oh, well, I'm glad to see that this was engaging and interesting. I appreciate it. The evidence base for data sharing from Kim. Yeah, so there is quite a lot that's been written recently about data sharing and why and what's the benefit and who, you know, is it worth doing? And there's very different things in very different disciplines. So for example, genomic data sharing has been happening for years now. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence about how being able to combine data from multiple studies has really kind of supercharged research in a lot of areas. Other repositories like Open Neuro, I know are able to, you know, pull together data from multiple studies and really say like, oh my gosh, look at what we can do with having all of this data available and data that is organized in the same way so that it can be easily combined. We've also seen, you know, especially with COVID, calls for making clinical trial data openly available so that we're not duplicating the same work. We're not, you know, pushing those negative results like into the file drawer and locking them away forever. You know, I think there's a lot of calls for it. And in the disciplines where data sharing has become more popular and more common, I think we are starting to see some really good data about how useful that is and the kinds of questions we can ask and answer with open data. Other areas, qualitative data, Kim, I know there's not a ton of qualitative data sharing right now, so it's maybe a little bit harder to make the argument about how valuable it is. So it's kind of an evolving process in some areas, I will say. Question about NDA tech support. So I have not submitted data to NDA, so I can't answer to their tech support, but I will say that they have just a lot of documentation. And so I think that I would definitely, let's see if we can find it right now, but NIH, I think that they would be probably pretty quick to answer, hopefully. If anyone has used them and wants to let us know, please feel free. But oh, okay, Olga's saying no. Okay, well, unfortunately, that's a bummer. If you haven't already, I would, let's see, what would I do? Let's see if they have a good, if you've just reached their contact us. Yeah, well, that's probably where I would start with the help desk. You know, I think with some of these repositories, they're still figuring out how they're responding to some of these new mandates and getting up to speed with some of these. And the things that I mentioned earlier around the, you know, common data elements for HIV research and other areas as well are still quite new. And so I think that there's a little bit of scrambling behind the scenes at some of these places to just, okay, we have to like update our documentation and we all have to be on the same page with what's happening. So it could be that there's some of that going on behind the scenes right now at NDA. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, and thanks for this note, Sarah, that, you know, it was a lot of work to prepare data. And, you know, I think that there's some work you can do in advance to, you know, maybe start using specific file formats in advance, understanding what the repository requirements are. But and so, yeah, that data sharing planning is really key. But even with all the planning, sometimes it's still going to take a lot of work. So thinking about, do you need to budget for someone to do that? Or at least budgeting in your own time to do that work. What other questions do you all have? Okay, who remains the point of contact for this on the data repository? I'm not sure I understand that question.
Ariel, this is Lakshmi here, and thank you. As I said, excellent presentation. So what I mean by the point of contact is, usually I've seen like data, like I've used publicly available data from Harvard Dataverse, for example. And if there are any questions pertaining to the data and like you don't understand a particular variable or you don't really understand how to, there's some concerns with the data, then there is somebody you can always reach out to. So who is going to be that for this particular data sharing?
Yeah, so it depends on the repository. Often they, so they're always going to list some are slightly different, but almost always they're going to list the contributors, because that's how you would cite the, original researcher. And often they will also have a point of the researcher's contact information or their ORCID ID, so that you can find them and reach out to them. So sometimes if the data is combined in a certain way, it might be a little bit less tied to a specific researcher, but generally it has the researcher's information, so that if you needed to, you could always reach out to them and ask questions. Sarah's not super excited to use future research data. Yeah, I will say, as someone who has shared qualitative data and has also tried to find good public qualitative data for educational purposes, I would love it if there was more examples out there of, I was chatting with a researcher the other day who was trying to teach, coding, data coding for qualitative research, and wanted to see examples of transcripts before and transcripts that have been coded. And it's, it's really hard to find that. So having more examples of data that is made available, that is coded in a really great way, that other people can learn from and use, would be really beneficial, even just for the education side, if not only for, the actual research purposes of the data. Okay, Tor. Yes, thank you, Tor, for that. Yes, there's a lot of details, and we're doing our best to keep on top of it, and kind of, we learn new things all the time, and try to update all of our guidance to reflect that. Okay, zero quant data. Okay, so question about tracking secondary use of data. I think so. We talked a little bit about data citation and this idea of citing data that you're using. And so tracking data citations, I think, is one of the easiest ways of tracking data reuse. So this idea that if you're using data from multiple studies in your study, you are citing all of those data sets in the references of your paper. And through that, with use of those DOIs or other kind of accession numbers, we can start to gather statistics around, how often has this data been downloaded, how often has it been opened or viewed, downloaded, and cited. And that's kind of one of the first ways, I think, that we're starting to look at reuse of data. And many repositories, so I can just share an example real quick of Dryad. Let's see here. Data Dryad. Oh gosh, my typing. Okay, so if we look at something in Dryad, for example, so here we have the metrics. We can see it's been viewed 7 times, downloaded once, and has not yet been cited. It was just uploaded today. so that's not very surprising. But here we can also see some of the information. We have the kind of contacting of the main submitter. So if we wanted to reach out and ask questions, here's the citation that we would be using in our paper, and information about the data. Yeah, looking at Susan's question about why we're using certain measures versus others that are approved for use. So I think, Susan, are you talking about the use of like common data elements? Okay. So yeah, that's a good question. I think that, you know, and once again, these are only for specific funding announcements. Are they really like calling out the need to use CDEs? My understanding of the language was that it was required for some, you were required to gather certain measures, and then other ones were recommended, and they would say like, here's a couple that we recommend that you take a look at. And if you're not using those, you might need to say, you know, we have a much better one, and here's why we're going to use that. I don't know that you'll necessarily need, will you need to say that in your data management sharing plan? I think in your DMS plan, in the standard section, you might say, you know, whenever possible, we are endeavoring to use these CDEs, except for, you know, this one case where we have a much better one for some reason. I think Judy has a general question about if anyone has searched for, requested, or used data from these repositories. I certainly have for some of them, but I have not used NDA, so I'd be interested in if anyone has used one for that repository. All right. Yeah, certainly the idea of data reuse as the goal, Susan, I hope will lead to more funding for secondary data analysis. That's really what we're pushing here. That would be great. Other questions? Yeah, Susan, so the presentation that Joyce and I have been doing in all the department meetings is like the 5 to 10 minute version of all of this. So much shorter and high level. Very unsettling. Okay, Susan, well, let me know if I can answer any more questions or help you get a little more settled with any of this. Thank everyone.
Yeah, I'm very glad Kim is going to create space next week for discussion about how folks are feeling about this. As someone who supervises master's level statisticians and data managers, I worry for them. I fear for them about how the last few months of a project is going to be while they're concurrently trying to get all this stuff ready for sharing. And at the same time, the investigative teams will be saying we need to get every single paper out that we think we might want to write so that we don't get scooped. So I think, like you were saying, Ariel, I think the positive of that will be maybe more attention to timelines and workflow and the like. But there could be some real stresses, especially in the initial experiences as folks begin to find their footing with this what may be a bit of a new way of working.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's going to be a lot of learning all around, learning as we figure out how can we do this in a way that makes sense, that works with our workflows, that creates a valuable output that does actually benefit science and is something that we all kind of want. So the next several months, several years, I think will be a lot of practicing and trying new things and maybe giving feedback and adjusting.
Yeah, and I'll reiterate my thanks to you and your colleagues for all you're doing, because it really makes sense to have specialized experts leading us through this process rather than each individual trying to figure it out on their own. And to that end, hopefully the industry group will come up with some master agreements soon so that, you know, we're not, each research group, each project are not having to get clearance on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, that's, it's definitely something that we want to do. I think right now the holdup is just on the repository side. They haven't really ever done that. So they were kind of like, well, what's this? But we have some time. So thank you, everyone. Yeah, Christine, I can't speak to your own individual group. I will definitely be updating our documentation, continuing to teach about this. I'm happy to come talk to other groups on a more like specific, maybe we could do like a depositing to NDA mini workshop or something. If maybe someone who could lead us through that, wants to partner on that, but yeah, happy to think through any of that with anyone. Yeah, it's a good question, Tor. So are we going to be, at this point, I'm happy if folks want to meet with me to chat about their plans. If you have questions, right now, we're not going to be editing plans or like doing, what a more kind of hour-long CTSI style, like we'll write the plan for you. And that's mostly because it's just me. So I kind of have to see what kind of support people will need. But as of right now, I'm happy to look over anybody's plan if you have questions, you want feedback. But I'm hoping that those templates that we put together will answer a lot of those general questions, or will give you a really good place to start. And then if you have more questions, then you can always reach out. And certainly I know that there's, I think the first deadline or that I'm aware of, I think a lot of people are submitting grants for like February 5th as the first kind of wave under this new policy. So if you are working on a grant for February 5th, now is a good time to chat with me if you want to, and not, over the Christmas break or something. So yeah. It does. Let me see, I just updated this morning and I've already forgotten. Does this apply to K grants? I don't believe so, but let me just double check my work. Oh, sorry. Yes, it does apply to K career development awards, K grants. It does not apply to T's, F's, etc. So some career development awards. So there is a whole list of all of the ones. So these are the ones that it applies to for the Ks. Yes, and the NIMH sample plans are very, very useful. So those are, like I said, the only ones that we've actually seen from NIH right now. So here we have our generic templates that we've created, and these are the sample plans. So you can kind of see, what those look like with the language that they use. Just copy it. For training grants, do we need to verify that the research being done by our trainees is covered under the parent grants data sharing agreement? I don't know about that, Rochelle. So training grants in general are not covered by this policy. It does not apply to T's. But I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I know the answer to that. So if it's covered by a broader policy or a broader grant, in that case, you might want to reach out to your specific program contact. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point, Susan. So yeah, even if you're submitting something before the deadline, so if it goes into effect, this goes into effect January 25th, if you're submitting before January 25th, for the first time, you won't have to follow this, but it's a good reminder that if you're resubmitting, if you're renewing, you will need to. So yeah, might as well plan for it, budget for it now. You might also submit to a journal that requires data sharing. So even if you're not required by your funder, your journal might need you to share data. That's something that I see a lot. Folks that are trying to publish in some of the PLOS journals that requires data sharing. So always good to plan. All right, so I think we're almost out of time. So I'm just going to put that link in there one more time so that you all have this. Like I said, this is the place that we will be updating. I've also, if it's, got some highlighted other articles here about other data repositories. So the qualitative data repository, Dryad, ICPSR, a little bit more deep dives into those if you want to learn more about that.
Thank you so much for really wonderful presentation and for being so accommodating for everyone's questions. And I'd also like to thank the audience for their engagement and really wonderful questions. I learned a lot from the Q&A as well as from the main presentation. So I'm sure we'll be following up with you. And again, I'd like to remind folks that at 10 o'clock a week from tomorrow, the Qualitative Working Group will be hosting a follow-up session to discuss our reactions to the new policy and also focus in on qualitative and mixed methods research implications of the policy. So we're looking forward to that. Kim posted that information in the chat. So with that, I think we should wrap up and let Ariel return to, no doubt, all the things that she has going on. We're only a few months away from D-Day, January 25th. So I'm sure you have a lot going on. But thanks again for making time for us this morning. This is really terrific. And thanks again, Rochelle, for organizing this very well attended and outstanding presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone.